Welcome, everybody. It's so good to have you all here tonight. Thank you for joining us. We'll get started in just a minute. We're going to let everybody get in through the virtual door and give them a little bit of time to get settled. It's great to have you here. Thank you for being with us again. As you're settling in, you can use the chat box and let us know where you're zooming in from. We're expecting a whole bunch of people to be enjoying tonight's webinar, and we're just going to give everybody a minute to get in through the door and have their audio connect, and then we'll just get started in just a minute or two. It's great to see the chat box starting to pop up. Got folks who are local. Where else are you coming in from? We've got folks from Glenside and Bala Cynwyd. Who else is out there? Where are we zooming in from tonight on this great Wednesday evening? It's good to see you all. Really excited. We're just getting another minute or two and then I'll get started. So welcome again. It's great that you're all joining us tonight for our craft show talk, Medieval Meets Contemporary. My name is Justina Barrett and I work in public programs at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. We have enabled closed captions, so if you'd like to use them, hit the CC button that is at the bottom of your screen. We are also recording tonight's webinar, and we will be sending it out to you in a follow-up email. We're holding time at the end for questions and your thoughts. You can go ahead throughout the presentation and use the Q&A box to put them in, and we'll get to those towards the end of the program. All right, so I am really excited to see you all here. We have a whole lot of people. South Carolina, I'm seeing. New Jersey, I'm seeing. It's really great that you're all here for this conversation tonight. We are going to be discussing some fascinating objects made in Europe centuries ago and how they can still influence artists today. Leading us through that discussion is Jack Hinton. Jack, say hello.
Hello, everyone. It's great to see you.
Jack is the Henry P. McElhenney Curator of European Decorative Arts and Sculpture at the Art Museum. He has curated various exhibitions at the museum. In the past year, the museum published his book, Renaissance Treasures, featuring the work of Edmund Folk Collection. His next exhibition, Circus Bourrelic Designs, will be looking at the work of contemporary French industrial designers and brothers, Ronan and Erwin Bourrelic. That's going to open on November 20th at the museum. Jack, thanks for being with us tonight. He will also be joined by Matthew Naftsker. Matthew, say hello.
Good afternoon. I'm Matthew.
It's great to have you as well. Matthew, is a multimedia artist, and he is inspired by historic artifacts, the distant future, and the questions between them. This is his first time showing his metalwork in person at the craft show. Matthew, thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
So the 45th annual Philadelphia Museum of Art Craft Show will be held November 5th through the 7th at the Pennsylvania Convention Center and will feature 170 artists in person, plus an additional 25 artists online through the website. The artists represent the finest work from across the country and indeed across the globe in various media. The craft show is the single largest fundraiser for the Art Museum, and over the past 44 years has raised more than $13 million for our institution. For more information about the 2021 craft show and to purchase a ticket, please visit the craft show website at pmacraftshow.org. By purchasing a ticket to the show, you will support our beloved institution of the city and enjoy the spectacular contemporary craft of the artists. So let's get started. I'm so excited to hear from Jack and Matthew on medieval reliquaries and how they inspire Matthew's work. They're going to talk for about 40 minutes, and we are saving time at the end, but go ahead and start populating any thoughts and questions you have into the Q&A box. Jack, Matthew, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Justina, and thanks everybody for coming again. So I'd just like to start by thanking Matthew for participating with me in this conversation, and somehow or other we're going to make medieval speak to contemporary, and I hope you all agree. So I'm going to begin just by situating our talk in the museum, in our medieval galleries themselves, upstairs on the third floor of the main museum building, represented by the wonderful Romanesque portal that we have from the Abbey Church of Saint Laurent, which is in the Loire Valley, also on a pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela, and something that really speaks to the atmospheric galleries that we have on the third floor and how they really allow us to walk back through time in a way. And on the other side is another piece of great medieval art in the collection, a roundel of Holofernes' army crossing the river Euphrates, which comes from a larger window dedicated to the Old Testament heroine Judith, that was once part of the Sainte-Chapelle, which is a jewel-like, amazing jewel-like church in the heart of Paris that was built for King Louis IX, Saint Louis of France. And it was basically the church as a treasure box for his relics of the Passion of Christ that he collected, including the crown of thorns, which also survived the 2019 fire at Notre Dame. The stained glass is also remarkable as a documented acquisition by a prominent Philadelphian, something bought by a man called William Pointel in about 1805. He was a printer and bookseller who acquired this piece on a visit to Europe, so an early kind of grand tourist from America. And it's actually one of the earliest known acquisitions in medieval art to come to these shores. So hands across the centuries, if you like. But these treasures from the museum's collection, and also the atmospheric gallery spaces, obviously they describe a distant past. Although, we could bear in mind that when the majority of the museum's collections were assembled and displayed in the main building in the 1920s, it was accepted in many quarters that medieval works of art, going back to the lessons of John Ruskin and the arts and crafts movement and William Morris in the mid 1800s, that they really thought that Gothic art could be or was an expression of an anonymous artisan's joy in creative work, and a means through which these workers could express their personality and ideas with their hands, as opposed to machinery. But I think that idea of craft, of materials and transformation perhaps is something that's interesting for us to keep in mind today. So perhaps as we examine other treasures of medieval art, we could channel our inner craftsperson, and we'll search for those threads between several hundred years ago and the present. So one of the most exceptional examples of medieval metalwork in the museum's collection is this object, which is a reliquary. That is, I'm sure many of you know what this is, but just to be clear, so that's a container or shrine in which the purported or actual physical remains of saints or other religious figures are housed. So this reliquary was made to house a relic of St. Babylas, who, as you know, was a bishop of Antioch, so Antakya in modern day Turkey, who was martyred in around 250 CE. So this is a remarkably well-documented object, because we know it was made as a new housing for a relic of St. Babylas in 1467, documented. And it was then part of an important collection of medieval sacral objects kept at the Cathedral of St. Blaise in Brunswick in Germany. And that treasure, is known as the Guelph treasure, and this was one of 140 relics that was part of that collection in an inventory that was taken in 1482. Now, you may already have heard of the Guelph treasure because its histories, it's really something of a mirror of German history over the past 1,000 years. So and I can't tell you the whole story because it's really long, but in any case, so the treasure was started in the 11th century, about 1030, by Count Leodolf and Countess Gertrude of Brunswick. And they founded the church that we see on the left, and it was sort of much renovated and enlarged afterwards. and they equipped it with its first reliquaries. Later on, about a century or so later, the duchy came into the hands of the Welf or Guelph rulers of Saxony, who further embellished the treasury with relics, and also this close association with the Welf family gave it the name Guelph treasure in the 1800s. Now, during the Reformation, Brunswick actually became Protestant, so the treasury stopped having a religious significance in a way and instead became of interest for its material value. Eventually, it was transferred to the Welf dukes, one of whom was Duke Anton Ulrich, the Herzog Anton Ulrich, of whom the museum in Brunswick is named after in his art collections. And it went on from him to the House of Hanover. And of course, the House of Hanover then becoming the Kings of England. By the early 20th century, so after the First World War and the revolution and financial instability in Germany, the treasure became available for sale by who were then the former Dukes of Brunswick, and they sold them to a consortium of art dealers, some very prominent and famous Jewish art dealers, in fact, and they purchased these things just before the stock market crash in 1929. And I mean, at the time, it was recognized as an incredibly important collection of medieval metalwork, and they were able to host and organize a series of what were blockbuster exhibitions of these objects that people came to see and could also buy from, a bit unlike museum exhibitions now, but still. So you see on the right-hand side, there's an image at the Cleveland Museum of Art in January 1931 of the great crowds of people that came to see this wonderful medieval treasure being shown there. And by that time, it was about 80 or so things left from the original 140. Now, you may have seen the news of the Guelph treasure more recently because it was the subject of a restitution claim from the descendants of some of the members of the Jewish art dealers' families of that consortium, because they sold the treasure, what remained of it and what wasn't sold on these tours, to the Nazi government in 1935. And it was argued by them that this was a forced sale. So nowadays, the rest of the Guelph treasure, what remains of it, is on display in the Kunstgewerbe Museum in Berlin, and is the property of the German state. And basically, it was a very long and circuitous discussion. Although the Nazi or Provenance Commissions ruled in the end it was a legitimate transaction, and the Supreme Court in the US basically said that the argument wasn't part of the jurisdiction of that court. It's a long, complicated story and really interesting one, something you could look up separately in the future. In any case, these photographs and this drawing show the collection in the royal collections of Hanover in the 1800s. And they also show the dozen or so all these images on the left here, you see the dozen or so arm reliquaries that were part of the treasure, which in general represents the significance of this form of the arm reliquary in the medieval period. But also looking at this, it's really kind of fascinating because you can see the range of all the different parts of the treasure. The book covers, there are portable altarpieces, there are these relics in the form of saints in their heads, and all the wonderfully exquisite pieces of precious and expensive metalwork that had been added to this treasure over the centuries. So basically, the Guelph treasure is a kind of catalogue of German religious metalwork and metal sculpture over the course of several centuries, which makes it really quite remarkable. What I'm showing you here is a fascinating object that also comes from the Guelph treasure, and it's also in the museum's collections in our galleries on the third floor. It's completely fascinating. It's a relic capsula. So it illuminates very strongly the tradition of venerating these physical remains or material items that belonged or could have belonged to Christian saints from the Middle Ages. Actually, it's a practice that has a really long tradition within the church because it was the Second Council of Nicaea in 787 that decreed that portable altars and even altars in general should have relics attached or housed within them. So it created a kind of fashion a kind of fashion really for consuming, acquiring, trading important relics, to the extent that the Reformationists in the 16th century said, well, there were more relics than there were people to get the relics from. It was one of their critiques, but nonetheless, this is a huge kind of trade. And this object is a reflection of that, because you can see inside this wonderful capsula on each side, so it lifts up, and you can see that there are, I think, about 45 or so labeled, captioned bits. I'm not even quite sure exactly what they are, and I don't think it's appropriate to have them tested. I think it's all bits of, we think, saints, bits of fabric, that represent these individuals. And what's really fascinating is that this capsula seems to be a kind of reduction of the entire contents of the Guelph treasury, of all the saints that are represented in it within a single object that then could be worn as this object of great power, this kind of micro treasury that conveys the significance and power of the whole. Pretty interesting stuff as a kind of container. And on the left here, you see this is one of the earliest relics in the Guelph treasure. So it's in the Herzog Anton Orlock Museum, but this is one of the arm reliquaries, an arm reliquary of St. Blaise, so the church after whom, the saint after whom the church was named, sorry. So and you can also see alongside it a head reliquary too of the same saint, St. Blaise. So in German, these are often referred to as speaking reliquaries, these types. But it's not literal. I mean, so there's a tendency to think of these forms, these arms or heads, as being a one-to-one kind of representation of their contents. So that the arm of St. Blaise should contain an arm bone, or the head of St. Blaise should contain a skull. And often these things do. It's not ruling that out, but they don't have to. So we know that there are arm reliquaries, for example, that contain unidentified fragments. So actually, what's important to know instead is that the arm form, and the arm form especially, and even the head reliquaries, had important liturgical and symbolic functions instead. So thus, the museum's arm reliquary, so I took it out, so this is fun. So I got to take it out off of display, and I took it down to the conservation lab, and my colleagues in conservation were lovely to let me play with it. And they let me grab a cell phone so you can see this juxtaposition of medieval and modern, but also you can get a good sense of scale. It's quite naturalistic scale of this piece. So this object then makes that function clear, right? So this is the hand of St. Babylas. It's being rendered naturalistically, so you can see his hand here in this gesture of blessing. So we don't know really what the relic was inside. We assume it was his arm, but what's more important here is the symbolism of the form. It's the power of the arm and the hand to act. So acting as if in life, but through the power of the saint and through the power of God, overcoming death, and then being able to intercede for you, perhaps the owner of the reliquary, or if you were lucky, if you're in the congregation, these relics were also used in liturgies to physically bless the congregation. So it's evoking that kind of relationship. But also what's really wonderful about that kind of spiritual elevation of the form is that the naturalism here also talks about some of the practices. So bishops wore jeweled gloves in liturgical ceremonies to distinguish the otherworldly nature of their hands. And I think this change of materials in our reliquary and his jewelry, and I'm sure you noticed the bling that was on St. Blaise's hand as well. It really helps to distinguish this sort of otherworldly nature and realm in which these objects exist, where they kind of occupy. And I just wanted to show you some other images of the piece, so you can kind of see it a bit more in the round. The sculptural treatment of the entire hand, these sort of bands of metal work that cover the body of the piece, and then the fringes, if you like, these sort of flat bands of gilded silver that are applied with jewels. And we'll look at the jewels in a little bit. And you can also see here a view you don't often get, you certainly don't get in the galleries, the underside. So you can see how that's sort of nailed up, attached to the bottom. I think that could be a sign of some restoration. Normally, quite often what you see is an inscription on these things, identifying the contents quite handily of the reliquary. And that's not here, but we know it's very solidly documented. The other fun thing to see here is a detail of the container. So you can see that there's a hinge door here of this cutout quatrefoil ornamentation. And you can see that there's a pin on the lower left side where that kind of hinge-looking thing is. Sorry, I wonder if you can see my arrow. There you go. Yeah. So that comes out, and then you're able to swing the door open. So that's where the relic would have been housed. And you can see here the empty kind of chamber in which it was kept, and then the oak around it. So there's a wooden core that gives the kind of foundation for the rest of the metalwork that goes over it. So really interesting then that you have this kind of object that it's a kind of slippage, because in a way, the relic, I mean, the form, its sort of gilding, its jewels, all of these sort of external parts that go around something kind of ugly, kind of a bone fragment, part of a dead being, however holy, that's kind of transcended and it's turned into something resembling a kind of holy or resurrected body. That's something made kind of perfect, made whole again, kind of imbued with that symbolic association of power and of the power of God. So perhaps, what we could say here is we have an object of great mystery, a sort of multi-layered meaning, and also something that's far more than a simple container. So, Matthew. So Matthew is a craftsman of metalwork and metal objects, whose pieces, also interrogate this idea of containers and vessels and symbolism and their potential meaning. So I thought, what we thought was that you could talk about your work in that context, but perhaps also just to maybe start by answering the question or approaching the question of how does your work respond to these ideas and the ideas of vessels and their meaning?
Well, I really love this idea of this precious interior. And what my objects, or these particular objects at least, are not necessarily, they're happily not holding the piece of a dead person. But which, I'm not going to be in that market anytime soon. But
I suppose it's an option for somebody who wants to try that out.
You are welcome to put whatever you want in these objects once you have them. But I love that idea of I think that's why I use gold in the interior, is it becomes transcendent in a material aspect. And we live in an age where religion is much more questioned and unknown, and we have more views of more religions and more beliefs and systems. And so I still have this precious space, this precious moment, but I've kind of taken the person out of it. And then oddly, sort of in opposition of the reliquaries, instead of the perfectly beautiful, inviting exterior giving blessings, it's simply more protective of that interior golden space rather than giving. And I think that maybe is, again, kind of in response, or at least my response to the current world and the events and what's happening. And, not that the world has ever been truly peaceful, it seems, but
certainly not in the medieval
response. Yeah.
Yeah. No, but that's great. So if you like, it's a kind of inversion.
Very much.
Yeah.
But
So,
I still, I often, when I show these objects, the question people have, the first thing is, well, what do you put in it? And I just even simply love that someone wants to know what to put in it, or has that question. Something has to be filled, something has to have something. And so I don't know, it's a belief in there. I don't know.
Yeah. So best to leave it open-ended, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Indeed.
So one of the other things that we spoke about was perhaps stylistic influence and the kinds of things that you're looking at and thinking about when you make your work.
Sure. So I guess we could go ahead and go on to some of those pieces.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want me to move forward?
Sure. So this is one of many objects that I've always found fascinating, and I'll probably mispronounce this, the Antikythera mechanism. And
sounds good to me.
It's the caption is there, but it was essentially a mechanical computer from estimated 100 BC. We've only found fragments of it. It was in a sunken ship. It's now, due to lovely aspects of technology, been scanned, and they've made what they believe to be working models of it, and it was, one, it's a mechanical computer, which is lovely in its own right, but two, what it was used for was star patterns and, finding the movements of the heavens, which I think is honestly maybe even more than the mechanical thing. I think that idea in itself is also a huge inspiration for me.
Mhm.
So it's a mechanical thing for mankind to reach out. And at the same time, I completely love the aesthetic of this ancient worn piece, which I try to imbue my own pieces with a history. It's like the next piece. Go ahead and go on to the next one if we could.
Yeah, we will. There we go.
There. And this is a much more common object, I think. Yeah, and I know that there's a few hundred of them, I think, or 100. The Roman dodecahedron, one's geometry, which is lovely, but it's a common object. I mean, I've heard guesses after using it for a pattern to knit gloves, which I'm not a knitter, so I can't really follow that, but it sounds great. Or measurements, using it as sort of an eyeglass. But it's really, it's unknown. And that idea of finding an object, you have no idea what it did. And we instantly, kind of like trying to fill a void, we have to figure out what it was for. And I think that's the nature of humans. And I love that, but it's also a riot because, this could have been a hat decoration. But we're guessing, and we're going to guess wrong for a while, I'm sure. And I love that. Again, that out of place object, out of place history. And to get into the fancier mode, the next ones, I'm sure many of you know the Fabergé eggs. These are just two examples made in Russia for the rulers, for the imperials, and this precious exterior with the surprise on the inside. Again, that opening, that preciousness. All of this, unlike either of our objects, is precious on interior and exterior, but it's something about that holding, that idea of a vessel. Always, I don't know, I think we find it always intriguing. I mean, the first thing, if you see a lovely little box, the first thing you don't look at the outside first much. You want to go open up all the little drawers and all the containers. And again, so these had a little bit more of an exquisite surprise on the inside. But so these are the things that I mean, but again, my objects are, take these pieces and bury them for 1,000 years and dig them up. And then what do they look like? And that's the feel I'm looking for. So
Yeah. So the survival being all the more remarkable.
Exactly, indeed.
Yeah. So I think the next images were perhaps, you were going to show us the making process, which I think is really fascinating.
And this is just a brief synopsis of some of the things, again, kind of pertaining to this particular series. But these protection spheres, this series, primarily titanium and copper. I'm creating a pattern, cutting out the individual sheets, and I start folding it into itself to make the three-dimensional object. So even, I don't know, I've been a metalsmith for over 20 some years, and I still love the fact that you're creating this dimensional object out of a flat sheet. There's something that's completely magic about that. And I sort of like the almost modern aspect of reducing the curves into flat planes. It has a little bit of playoff digital work for me in a way. Going on to the next one, it just shows that piece continuing a little bit. So I'm creating the piece and I'm actually welding all the individual seams because when I start enameling it, if I solder it, it doesn't hold together in the same way. I think I don't remember what the next one we have here is. So once I've created the full form, I start making and machining all the individual parts for each piece. I've set them essentially, much like the gemstones on the reliquary, I'm populating the surface. I'm giving it a richness, a dimension and depth, and almost a preciousness because of details more than materials. And on to the next. And so there were some in the last slide as well, but I'm just showing. So the enamels, which is vitreous glass. It's glass fired in a kiln it fuses to the metal. The ones on the left, the blue matte pieces, and the ones on the right are fired, it's the same pieces, same color. Things show up differently after you fire in a kiln. And there's a couple of the protection spheres with the first layer up above there, and lots of machine little parts. And I make an obscene amount of parts sometimes for all of these objects, which is why I made a ridiculous little video, because I started having fun with all the parts and started thinking of other pieces to do. So here's this little video of that.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's all right.
I'll show the video.
Yeah.
This is the problem when you have me controlling the PowerPoint.
This really makes me want to build a chess set, by the way.
Oh.
So this is what happens kind of at 3 a.m. when I've been working too long and I start looking at my stuff too much. So it's okay. And so going on to the next, it's just a little short video of me awkwardly pulling a piece out of a kiln. Again, it's one of the little things that just becomes magic of watching something. And I shortened a video of about 3 to 4 minutes into a few seconds, but going from 1400 degrees and cooling down to almost room temperature, watching that glass change from molten glass essentially into a colored surface. I mean, I don't know, again, 20 years later, that's the sort of thing that's still magic. It's a really basic thing, but it's what keeps me coming back to doing this. And so continuing on from there, this is just kind of showing the progress of the pieces. This is showing actually the piece that's next to me at one stage, showing multiple layers of enamel after firing it. After that, what do we have next after that? Yeah, so and I kind of, this is almost seemingly going backwards in a way. I take that polished glossy object and I do work to it to remove that, to gain an age in the history, because I want it to be the unknown found object versus the Matthew made this yesterday object. Again, the reliquary had that you showed especially has almost a patchwork feel and aspects to it. And again, it's a historic object where someone maybe restored it, maybe not quite as well as they could have. And I like the idea of objects that have been found and probably used wrong for a century by a different civilization. Again, that's my kind of the longer view of history. But so this is this piece, and I go on and do more welding to expand the piece essentially. And my kiln is only so large, so I can't fit the entire thing in there. So this is also a picture of my wreck of the studio with a beautiful mug by Dolores Fortuna, another potter in the show. She does great work. And so anyway, that's a little bit of progress there. I think we show a few finished pieces after this.
Yeah.
Remember correctly. Yeah, just a few other pieces in that series. These ones kind of came and left before I could get really proper studio shots of them, for better or worse. But
So
again,
do you
same
feel?
with different-
Oh, sorry to interrupt you. So do you feel like these should be seen as sort of objects that were made all at one time, or do you want them almost to have this kind of additive quality where the objects themselves almost are kind of adding these elements to themselves?
That's a lovely question. I think it depends on the body of work. I think these, I picture them as relatively whole in their making, but then degrading from like almost being reduced more than being built up.
Mhm.
But I mean, that becomes in question too, because you see the evolution of pieces. These are a little simpler and more subdued than the monster spiky thing next to me.
And did they come before the monster spiky one next to you?
This is the 7th in the series, and that was actually 5 and 6.
Okay.
but I also like the playing with the different colors and such as well. As just a joy. I don't know. So yeah, that evolution is pretty lovely. There are other pieces I do that definitely build them, cut them into multiple parts, put them back together, add things, subtract. I do that some with these, but that rebuilding idea is something I love. So it's a good question. And I don't know what we have from there. Oh yeah, so
a big one. Yeah.
Yeah, this is the one next to me again, but just a few shots. And this one got a little more complex. I like the facets on the interior, just the more I don't know, it's holding more of a question perhaps.
And it's showing, so here we're seeing that I think you said you were sort of building them with a double wall somehow.
Yeah, correct. So it's again primarily titanium and copper, but it's a hollow vessel. So you're not seeing a cast object, you're seeing something fabricated. So I'm essentially building two isohedrons, basically spherical objects. And each of them is cut and then created and built. So yeah, it's oddly enough, for being a big object, it's extremely lightweight because it is just this hollow form, which makes it much more complex to build, but adds just a different dimension to it that I don't know any other way to gain. It is it does have a latching mechanism as well.
Yeah. And then the spikes, they're built, right? They're not kind of found object.
Yeah, that would be smarter. But I've never, my work looks like found work, but I make every single part because it's just, I love it when other people do it, but for me, it's never satisfying to take a found object and, and make something from it. So I'm kind of like the initial, or the picture a while back is I machine and build and make every single part. So it's built out of tubing and sheet and wire and rod and machining parts. And I just want more of the differentiation from, I don't know, it has to have its own voice and be a little bit other than a found object.
Yeah. And that makes sense, and you can see it.
Yeah. And this is just going back to, this actually was the original piece in the series. Oddly enough, real quick, I ended up doing a commission of a number of these for a portion of Disney. In the whole Marvel series, there's a fellow known as the Collector who collects unusual objects from the entire universe, so to speak. And they built when they commissioned me, she couldn't tell me what they were for. And I had to do doubles of each piece, which I don't do. So that was a challenge. But there's actually a ride in Disneyland, the one in California, is that right? I don't know. I'm not good at the.
I think that's Disneyland, yeah.
But there's a ride based on this character's fortress that you go into, and there's two elevators. And so these are in cabinets in the elevators, and I think you're not supposed to know which elevator you're in, which is why there had to be duplicates. So I was actually sort of impressed that they actually bought artwork from artists, and it's not just nothings. So it's sort of but I like the idea that, the idea of collecting and collectors, and it went to a slightly fictional level with this, which I thought was sort of beautiful.
Yeah. Have you sold anything to Doctor Strange?
Not yet. Maybe this will be the next object he uses.
Right.
So,
that's wonderful.
Yeah. So sort of a weird twist to it all. I wasn't expecting.
Yeah, but I think that's great that you've got that kind of recognition, and also places where people can encounter your objects and be surprised, right?
and have no clue where or what it is, which is also right.
See, well, it might be helpful if it had a label, but
but that loses the narrative somehow.
Right, yeah.
But it was fun nonetheless, and I still like the fact that they're going up and down these elevators probably hundreds of times a day. I think it's a riot.
Yeah, well, I guess a sharp-eyed fan will
Yeah.
eventually recognize that it's your piece, and they'll find you that way.
Yeah.
Well, it's been really fun working with you and looking at your work and trying to make or making connections with medieval objects in the collection. And I don't think they're forced. I mean, I think they're genuine and they're there for us to see. And so, as we discussed, I just thought it'd be nice to come back to the arm reliquary for a little bit and talk about the materials and the processes here, and maybe some interesting kind of connections through time that we might make. Obviously, you have the hand of Babylos that's made by raising or embossing or representing the flat sheet of metal. So I suppose starting from that simple building block, it's again not so different from how you work in your protection spheres. And in fact, what we know is that the arm, the parts of the hand, I don't think I've got a good slide in the next image, otherwise I'd go back. The hand's built with parts, so it's not whole. And frankly, why would you do it that way?
Yeah,
so
logically,
no. So it's got the parts of the hands soldered together and the fingers made individually in joints. So it also has that kind of additive quality. And the other thing that's interesting is that we've got this core to the piece. It's wood, so you can see on the image on the right, just where we have the sort of damage to this little flower. You can see the wood underneath that it really does give form to the whole. So this kind of idea of using materials in a smart way to build up your vessel, again not so different despite being nearly 600 years apart at this point. And also I think the idea of maybe I suppose that kind of almost the reproduction of mechanical looking parts, or mechanical type of reproduction, is really interesting to me here, because if we were to look at these strips of decoration that go across the reliquary, you can see in the image on the left and the right. So those are stamped, but they all have the same pattern. So they're not, I mean, they're hand produced, they're hand stamped, but they weren't all individually hammered by some guy in the metalworking shop. It seems like they had a press, and if we think about the time, this is sort of early printing technology kind of moment. It seemed like they were pressing these in order to have kind of ready supply of this material to add to the reliquary. And I think this is really interesting kind of connection between the centuries. And then we have all the jewels. We have enameled flowers. They're a bit discolored, but they're sort of pinned all over the piece, like your additions to your forms, and also the jewels. And the fun part with the jewels is you can see that they have, I think in some of these images, if I can find my pointer, slightly different attachments to the settings for the jewels, to the body of the reliquary. So you can see some have some engraved decorations, some are plain, some are precious or semi-precious stones, some are glass paste, so a kind of paste of silica and lead and other ingredients that was fired to make these jewel-like but not really jewel objects. Yeah. So again, they're put on the back because I think that's a good place to put your slightly less precious things. But this idea of the sort of additive quality of these elements giving meaning to the whole object, I think is actually something that speaks to one of your interests. And the other thing that really kind of drives me crazy with this object is, we know it was all made in the same year. We know it was done in 1467. And yet the makers of it decided, for their own reasons, to add things that seemed like they came from different moments or different styles, different periods in time. They have this very clumsy application of this metal strip here. There's no reason for it really at all. And because it's all made at once. And what I'm really wondering is whether this object being made to rehouse a sacred relic in 1467 was deliberately being made to be a bit anachronistic, or being made to look somehow damaged, as if it had existed for centuries previously, like other reliquaries within the treasure, more famous relics like the arm of St. Blaise, or this arm of St. Lawrence. So actually the arm of St. Lawrence on the right, it's in the same treasure as in the Guelph treasure, made in Hildesheim rather than Brunswick. The arm of St. Lawrence was used to house a different relic. It was different saint, I think an apostle before it became St. Lawrence's. These things kind of get switched around. And I just sort of wonder if the makers of our St. Babylas reliquary had similar things going on in their mind, where they were trying to kind of speak to this history in their own present, which, you know, really bakes your noodle, because this is 600 years ago, but just goes to show that some things perhaps haven't changed so much as we might imagine.
Indeed.
So that was fun. And I think what we're going to do now is go on to questions hosted by Justina.
Yes.
Although I was going to start us off with one, if Matthew doesn't mind.
Sure.
So I selfishly hog the questioning, because I know our guests will want to ask you things too. But I'd love to know, you know, so what would you like someone to say about one of your pieces when they encounter them in 500 years?
I just want them to have questions. I want them to look at it and have to work really hard to understand the time period, or, you know, I mean, I love that there's so many objects. You know, we look at the reliquary and we know there's a religious history, but what if we didn't know anything about the religious history? What if that was context was completely unknown to us? You know, why is this object with a piece of a body here inside it? Like, what that would make even less sense. So I like that same idea of no context, and they are going to think it's either a scientific instrument, or they're going to think it's to knit gloves again. I don't know. I love things that give people questions. So that's really what I hope for.
Well, thank you, Matthew. That is a beautiful segue into asking questions from our audience, because I think we are fascinated by the work you do, and we're fascinated by the collection, Jack, that we have at the Art Museum. Some folks want to ask Jack about saints and reliquaries. Have either of you been to St. Anthony's in Pittsburgh? That has a huge collection of relics. I think Joanne is saying it's the largest collection in the US. Have either of you gone on larger expeditions to look at reliquaries, either here or in Europe? Jack, I'm sure you have, but Matthew, I'd love to hear too, what your relic.
I'm sort of ashamed. I lived in Pittsburgh for 7 years and I didn't know that. You know, the Carnegie has a lovely collection of many things, but that's okay. That's on my bucket list now, my short bucket list. So no, I only through the magic of the internet.
Well, that's pretty good magic. How about you, Jack? What's your reliquary trails involved?
I haven't been to St. Anthony's in Pittsburgh. I was just trying to remember. I know there's one in South Philadelphia on Broad Street. I forget the church, but it's got a really remarkable collection of relics and reliquaries. So is that it? Well, anyway, all right, fair enough. I mean, you know, it's interesting that anywhere you go in Europe, I mean, very often, at least Catholic countries, they'll have very fascinating treasuries or collections of church treasures that can be quite fun to visit. I mean, to be honest, because I was looking at the Saint-Chapelle roundel when we started, I was thinking about the Saint-Chapelle on the Ile de la Cité in the middle of Paris, and how that whole building is like an inverted reliquary box when you go inside it. And of course, the point was it was meant to house the crown of thorns, so it really was supposed to be special. But that, I don't know, I often go back to that and think about visiting, because it's pretty fancy, but you get Viollet-le-Duc quite heavily in the 19th century. Other favorite relics might be, I think there's another crown of thorns relic at the British Museum. I'm quite fond of going to visit, but there are many wonderful ones.
Well, thank you. And we just had a quick question from Richard. You're talking about St. Blaise. Is that St. Blaise from Dubrovnik? Or do you, I mean, I'm asking you like you know the whole saint list of saints.
I don't know if it was from Armenia or Turkey. So that would be a bit over, wouldn't it?
Yes, not the same then. We'll
So
figure that out.
I'm not sure, but we can get back to you.
And then this is a fun question for you, Jack, but I think Matthew, it really speaks to what you were just talking about, people in the future not knowing what your objects are used for. The question is, when we have an object that we don't know what it was used for, do we use paintings as a source to get some context? Have you done that, Jack? Have you used, I know you have you used paintings or print images to fill out the meaning or the function of something you don't know?
Yeah. Yes, I'm sure that I have. As to whether I can think of a good example in the next 20 seconds in order to answer your question is a good one. And I would say probably not, but again, let me get back to you. Yeah, I mean,
okay, I'll go on to Matthew then.
It's always fun to have these juxtapositions, especially in the museum. It's a real pleasure for us to be able to do that.
Although I do think it's sort of ironic, I think was your first or second slide was a drawing of the collection. So that didn't necessarily give it meaning, but it gave it a context of all the pieces of that collection. I think I do paintings that are put my pieces in a weird context, or not a context. I don't think I do either, but it is fun to go to a museum and look at everything that is not the focus of a painting. And that becomes incredibly fascinating. I'm here in Wisconsin at the Wisconsin Museum of Art. There's a painting of St. Francis. And like, just honestly, it sounds funny, but the robe he's wearing, it's just fluid and alive and beautiful. And it's just this amazingly quiet, powerful painting. And that really doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the meaning of the painting, but is the objects and the physicality of things that present themselves from things of age and history that speak to me quite a bit.
Yeah.
It's really great to hear you say that, Matthew, because that is, in fact, the founding of the Art Museum was founded as a decorative arts museum to give inspiration to artists and artisans. So it's good to hear you say that. And also, can you just share a little bit about what your educational background is? Like, how did you start making these? What kind of training do you have?
I'm a mutt. I went to I grew up in a very small town in eastern Colorado where there's kind of nothing. Joined the Marine Corps to escape it, was there for 4 years, came back out and started a dual degree at Colorado State University in Fort Collins in mechanical engineering and fine art.
Okay.
And I, through happenstance, mainly working full-time as a young man, whatever, I missed my aptitude test to take the math test for the engineering classes, so I couldn't actually take any engineering classes my first semester. And as often happens, art was relegated to the secondary degree. So since it was my secondary degree, all the primary artists got to choose their majors first in classes. And so when I signed up, almost the only thing left was metalsmithing. And so that's why I took my first metalsmithing class. And I fell in love with it. It was because it had so much technical nature that you have to get over. So it fit both parts of my brain. I have to get over the technical nature to get to the fine art portion. And that just answered, I don't know. And so I just kind of said to heck with it and went for it. And I'm still here. But I actually left school about 1.5 years later because as someone putting themselves through school, I felt like I wouldn't be able to afford to make art if I kept going to school. And I love school. I've gone back. I've been accepted to colleges again and again and decided, no, I have to keep making work. So it's sort of funny. So I have a degree of formal training, but I'm 90% self-taught.
Well, I'm delighted to know that you enjoyed your metalsmithing class because you have these objects now that we can enjoy. Jack, were you going to follow up on that?
No, I was going to say, talk about finding your calling. I mean, it's great that path opened up to you in that way.
Happenstance and chance.
Yeah. And I'm not sure we did say this, but could you give the origin story to those objects we've been looking at? How did these come to your vision to make is the question. So I'm thinking the little capsules or the one next to you. What's the
So
origin story?
the first ones I actually made in that brief span of college. They were different, but still the same feeling. And I made 2 pieces, very intricate for the time. I basically I kind of slept in the studio and ignored the rest of my classes. So that's all I did. But I made these pieces and was going to New York City with some friends of mine. First time I'd been to the city was in East Village, and stepped off a curb. And it sounds ridiculous, but that was the first time I actually remembered where these images were coming from. And frankly, from my childhood, I remembered just in sort of troubled times, I have a very busy brain, which is both good and bad, creating these pieces in my head and spinning them and just imagining them. And so they really were a protection sphere for me at the time. So it created these, it was a space to create for myself. But I didn't realize it until, months later. And so building on them now, it still has that feel. I call them protection spheres very much for a reason. I really love that golden protected space. It's more about that than anything else. But I want them to be unknown and found throughout history. So it's sort of an odd origin story, if you will, but that's where they came from.
And you had asked this, we'd asked this earlier, and I think you answered, they are vessels to some degree to you, but not necessarily. And what do you envision they contain? Laura asks, what is it that you're thinking they contain? And that'll be our last question, I think.
Well, I could just joke whatever you wanted to, but it does mean more than that. It's just maybe the idea of possibility and just maybe a holding of self. So I don't really picture a physical object so much as just a preciousness of idea and, of the golden things.
Oh, well, we're going to end on that. I don't think there's a better way to end than on the golden things. Matthew, thank you so much for your time tonight. Jack, as always, thank you for sharing parts of the PMA collection. It's so wide and deep. Thank you both. Thank you behind the scenes folks, Deb Myers in Membership and Visitor Services, Steve Keever in AV, Nicole, our captioner. And thank you to all of you for participating. Just by being here, you're supporting the Art Museum. If you're a member or you need to renew your membership, please do so we can keep you connected with the Art Museum, get you free admission into the museum and more member programs like this. And everyone, please join us November 5th through November 7th at the Pennsylvania Convention Center. Please. Go to pmacraftshow.org. I want to say that the financial gifts that are raised by the museum from the show are generated through various means, but no portion of the sales collected from the artists go to the museum. The artists keep 100% of their sales. Funds are raised through support from our generous donors, and we have many of them on the screen below. Our loyal patrons who are attending opening night events, and of course the admission to the show itself. So please go ahead and get your tickets. And just know that we also have another webinar next Wednesday night, as we'll be looking at ceramics and the narratives that they can tell. Thank you all. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Jack. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, everyone. Thank you.
Cheers.
Take care. See you in November.
I hope so.
Yeah.